Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 23 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, between 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock p.m. Central European Time, we've gathered together from literally all over the world to share our experiences as we all navigate through the pandemic. Most of us are still under some form of lockdown. We're all engaging in social distancing. It's unclear when the pandemic will end and how humanity will fashion the world beyond the pandemic. Humanity Rising has been convened in the conviction that if people of goodwill from all over the world come together, we can actually have an impact on the world to come. That's the core business, if you will, of Humanity Rising. We are in the middle of a program started 4 days ago around strategies for change. And in some ways, the panel today on radical collaboration is one of the most important so far. As we were contemplating initiating Humanity Rising, I engaged in a thought experiment. And I asked myself the question, what one thing could the larger, I would say, progressive movement, all those of us that are working for the common good and a better future, what's the one thing that we could do differently that would make the critical difference? And that's when we came up with the term, actually, radical collaboration. If you think about the socially responsible, socially positive, progressive movement around the world, we're extremely numerous. There are upwards of 10 to 15 million NGOs around the world, all working on virtually every conceivable issue. We often protest and engage in activism of all kinds. And yet the world is getting worse, not better. Climate change is spinning out of control. And scientists and diplomats the world over are saying that this next 10 years is perhaps the most critical 10 years in the entire history of humankind. Because if we don't change our current course, we could lose the world as we know it by 2030. And at some level, all of us know this to be true. I was very interested that the family members in the George Floyd funeral in Houston several days ago made a very similar comment to the one that I'm making now as we begin this very important discussion on radical collaboration. They said, what if all the thousands of groups that had ignited after his death would come together? What an impact that would be. And it's the fact that we don't that constitutes the major part of our ineffectiveness. And we're running out of time because the pandemic is just a harbinger of things to come. So this question of social cohesion, this question of radical collaboration at a moment when we have to proactively, almost promiscuously, collaborate together in every conceivable way so that the whole is not only more than the sum of our parts, but is so clearly envisioned and designed that it has the kind of impact all of us know we need to make for the world to become more healthy, more sustainable, more resilient, and more aligned with natural systems. So I really want to thank all of you for joining. I want to thank Awake TV and all of our social media partners. We're being beamed out live to 10 to 15,000 people today. And I want to just welcome everybody to this conversation on radical collaboration. And I'll turn it over now to Peter Mary, my dear friend and colleague, who has put this entire program around strategies for change together, and will initiate the program today. Peter?
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, nice to be back. Although I was saying it's strange on a Saturday to jump back on the computer, having been out on the water with my kids. But here we are on a great subject. In fact, one of the things that I remember some systems thinker telling me at some point was that the relative complexity of a challenge determines the diversity of players you need to solve the challenge. So the more complex the challenge, the more diversity of partners you need to solve it. And we know that diversity can go two ways. It can, the bell curve, it can, if we don't manage it well, it makes us less effective than the lack of diversity. But if we do manage it well, it can enable us to achieve solutions that we hadn't thought of before. So this question of radical collaboration in the context of the hyper complexity and the speed of change that we're facing is a really key one. To say something about this panel, I'm going to introduce each one of them as we go in turn. We're this weekend, having had 10 days of women voices and then about 7 days of youth voices, we're giving ourselves a men's weekend today and tomorrow. So we've got two panels of men who, all of whom, as I've got to know them, are beautiful human beings. Of course, before next week, we go into a series of workshops focused on specific themes with a diversity of players from around the world and different contexts. And today, in the order which we'll go, we have Daniel Wahl and Emanuel Kuntzelman and Jeffrey Genung and George Poor. And I'll introduce them one at a time as we go on. And then they'll have about 12 minutes each. I'll rudely interrupt them if they go beyond that. And after that, we'll go into a dialogue together. Feel free to contribute your thoughts in the chat. Make sure if you want everybody to read it, that in the drop down of who the chat goes to, you select both panelists and participants. You can, of course, direct your comments only to the panelists if you choose. But if you want everybody to read it, make sure you select participants as well. So starting off with Daniel Wahl, who I've known for a few years in the context of his great commitment to sustainability. And he coined this term that has stuck with me that I thought was so powerful, called cooperative advantage. Everyone talks about competitive advantage, but what is cooperative advantage? And in that context, done a lot of great work around the subject of regenerative cultures. Again, a culture all about the relationships between the people. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing each of the speakers. If you want to know more, each of them has a profile on the Ubiverse, so feel free to look them up there and find out what they're involved with. But for now, great pleasure to introduce Daniel to share with us his thoughts on how does he see the way we can best proceed to achieve the radical collaboration we need to deal with the complexity we're facing. So over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jim. Nice to be on a call with both of you. I was just reflecting how it's a long way from the 2020 climate leadership campaign and the meeting in Belo Horizonte, where we met in 2009. And yeah, radical collaboration with whom is, for me, the big question, because I think it goes even beyond those hundreds of thousands or even millions of NGOs that are out there trying in different ways at different levels of this scale-linked, interconnected whole that we're participating in to make a positive difference. And for me, it really is about remembering that life is a planetary process. And if we want to respond to the converging crisis we're now facing, we have to remember that we belong to the land and the land does not belong to us. We are expressions of life. And if we let that come forth wisely, we can do what life does best, which is create conditions conducive to life. That means literally in that decade or the next 2 or 3 decades coming at us fast, to redesign the human presence and impact on Earth within 3 decades. To shift away from that map that all of you know, where we have these straight lines drawn by colonializing nations, systems of power over the whole system of the nation state, we sense we're so stuck with, but we're not. It's a relatively recent socio-political construct that comes actually from the time when we had already lost that grounding. And the map you see there by a geographer called Robert Zooks shows all the river systems of the world. And that's what I mean, to just give you an idea, what does this word bioregional pathways mean? It means coming back home to the biophysical reality of the places we inhabit. And after this, well, already facing climate change, but particularly through the pandemic we're now going through, we're really forced to ask ourselves the question whether, as everybody seems to be in agreement who's on these calls here, that we don't want to just bounce back to the status quo. We don't just want to adapt a little bit and rebuild the system we had prior. We need to bounce beyond. And in resilience theory, it's when you stop looking just at ecosystems resilience and you start looking at the resilience of socio-ecological systems, that the capacity for anticipation and foresight comes in. That's one of the little contributions that the human species as a humble member in the community of life can make to now see that our actions are absolutely unsustainable and cannot continue like that, and that we need to move and make this transformative jump. And it's in many ways a rite of passage to come back home into the community of life that we lost during, or left during, the Enlightenment, taking a path that also gave us a lot of very powerful technologies and insights that we don't want to miss, but we need to reintegrate them with the deeper wisdom of our species history, which is that most of our ancestors have lived bioregional for most of the existence of our species. And I particularly like the framing that John Stewart takes on evolution, and when he says that evolution is a process of diversification and subsequent integration of that diversity at higher levels of complexity. And the most important bit here is that in every step of the evolutionary journal, that jump to integration at higher levels of complexity has been predominantly through cooperative interactions. And when we really begin to see life as a planetary process, we see how competition has always just been the fine-tuning at the surface, the ripples on the ocean, the waves on the ocean. But the sea of life is a sea of symbiosis and collaboration and cooperation. And so for us, it's now, this is a clock that is telling me. For us, it's now time to find ways to make that jump. And for me, there's a big danger every time we make one of those evolutionary jumps, which is that we jump from the previous extreme to the opposite other extreme. So right now we hear a lot of people talking, it's the big journey from the ego to the eco. But if we really sit with what is regeneration, we can understand that the one tension, the polarity, the creative polarity that life operates in, all life, is to be simultaneously for oneself and to be at the same time as part of a larger whole. And it is in acknowledging that both of them are important that we actually get the potential of being in service to life And in that understanding of life, life is ourselves and the ecosystems in which we participate in that have brought us forth. And we literally try to act as life again, informed by a humble apprentice and stewardship of the evolutionary process, trying to fit into that process more humbly, and trying to study the patterns of nature to understand how we can refit ourselves. And many of you might be familiar with this Three Horizons framework, which also very beautifully, to my mind, asks a few questions. If you see the red line of business as usual, no longer fit for purpose, declining, but it is not declining completely. The fact that in the future there is still a little bit of red line asks us, what is it of the old system that we don't want to throw out as baby with the bathwater and that we want to keep? And the fact that the green line is already here means that there are already pockets of the future in the presence that we can study from. I'm personally convinced that the scale at which we build the new system that makes the old systems obsolete is simultaneously at the community and the bioregional scale. The community scale in and of itself is too small to create the whole systems design with all the synergies in place to both regenerate ecosystems and meet human needs at the scale of just a community. But we can do that at the scale of a bioregion. And in this fertile space between the red and the green line is the second horizon, where we are right now, where we constantly have to navigate the dilemma of being hospice workers of the old system, bringing those people along with us somehow, and midwives of the new system. And it's the time of compromise, it's the time of experiments, and for me particularly, it's the time of honoring diversity. If we want to re-own the fact that we are life, then we have to own that all our diversity is life's diversity, that even our diversity of opinion and perspective is part of the soup from which novelty, innovation, and creativity can arise. And particularly with the larger groups of people that are overall trying to create a healthier, better planet. Some of them in a very technocratic way and a carbon counting way, and others in a very deep way of really asking the deeper question, why are we here, and what is our purpose, and how do we change our way of being, not just what we're doing. And all of that is important, the whole spectrum. And what I so wish that we would step into now after COVID, the radical collaboration that we now need is to honor the fact that diversity is okay, and that this is going to be a journey that we might never reach the end of, because the whole system keeps changing. But we can walk shoulder to shoulder with people that we don't necessarily agree on everything on, but we agree that we do want to create a more livable planet and a more just planet, and a planet that works for more people. And so how do we really embrace diversity as the source of creativity, as we also understand that we deeply reconnect to life as life? And to do that, we need to refit our patterns of habitation back into biophysical patterns. And watersheds are one particular way of starting. That's why I moved to the island of Mallorca many years ago, because it's an easy, well-defined bioregion. We need to really re-inhabit our bioregions, but we need to enable everybody everywhere to do so. So this is not a parochial pulling back into just a little survival bubble as the world's going through chaos. It is about building the local and regional levels of redundancy and resilience, but also enabling through global collaboration other places to do the same. I'm going to jump over this. You can find this in lots of my writing. If you just go onto my Medium blog, Daniel Christian Bar Medium, you'll find a lot. And the same here. This is too much for 12 minutes, but it's showing how in the redesign, we need to redesign the materials that we use, the products, the buildings, our communities, the way our levels of production and consumption, all of that. But for me personally, I've, in the last 4 years, gone through a journey from having been quite focused on bioregional work here on the island, to then my book came out, Designing Regenerative Cultures, in 2016. And then I started networking between all these bioregional initiatives like the Regenerative Communities Network, and again, my old friends from the Global Eco-Village Network and the Transition Network, all these initiatives that are beginning to see how important the bioregional scale is beyond the community scale. And I spend a lot of time on these radical collaborative Zoom calls between lots of organizations. And what I want to bring to this conversation today is how in our radical collaboration do we not get too enticed by the technologies we use, that we can now have these meta-level conversations globally that are easier to have than actually the cross-sector, multi-stakeholder, real life, real people, real place-sourced activities in our communities, in our bioregions. And how do we find the right balance between working between the two? Because I certainly in my life in the last 4 years have lost that balance and have spent too much time on the global collaboration and networking thing. And I'm now, that's why the picture's at the bottom, I'm now coming home, re-inhabiting, returning to my bioregional work and really looking at the community that is close to me, the Milan, the red kite, or the Mediterranean tortoise, that are both listed species living in my backyard. And how do I do what I talk about on this island in the Mediterranean, and at the same time keep the door open to share the learning? And I think that's the challenge we now all have to do, that we yes, we need to globally connect, but we need to ground our activities, and we need to ground it also in a different way of being. And we need to live that, to my mind, in order to be able to also nurture it at the global scale. And I would love to hear what the other panelists, how they wrestle with the global local dynamic in their own lives as they want to collaborate and make a difference. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Right on time. If you'd be happy to share those slides with us, we'll put them in the group in the Humanity Rising, and people can access them there and then go on and check out more on your site and things. That would be great. Thank you so much. And some really great questions, really, that you've left us with there that I think provide us with lots of food for the dialogue to come. So wonderful. So now to introduce Emanuel Kuntzelman, who calls himself social entrepreneur, as well as a number of other things. The thing I picked out of your profile that I wanted to share, Emanuel, was your work with what you call the global purpose movement. Because one of the big conversations that we had in yesterday's group and in the group before was the importance of purpose, of shared purpose, of people being able to connect to a shared purpose that creates the conditions in a way for collaboration between people who maybe normally might not collaborate. And obviously there's been a shared purpose around COVID to keep people healthy, to protect our health workers and enable the health systems to cope. So Emanuel worked with the Global Purpose Movement, combined this into Unity Earth, I understand, recently. So very interested to hear what you have to say about what you've learned around how to create the conditions for effective radical collaboration.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank everyone for joining us here today. Well, I would say, first of all, yes, purpose is critically important to everything we're doing. We all need to take a deep inner dive and explore that purpose and put it into action to make a difference. I would say, and indigenous cultures have said as well, that there have been 3 great miracles in the history of the universe: the beginning, the big breath, the big wow, the appearance of life on Earth, thirdly, the appearance of self-reflective consciousness in Homo sapiens. And we are now in the midst of the beginning of the 4th great miracle of our universe, which is the transformation, the great turning, the great transition, whatever terminology you want to use it. And if there were never a higher, better purpose than now, I don't know what it is. So the purpose is there. The important thing is for each of us to explore our inner purpose and understand how we can best put it into action to serve the whole. The movement that we are talking about, this movement of social justice now in particularly, and bringing us all together in this critical time. It's often been said that it's nameless and that it's leaderless and maybe formless. Well, today I'd like to give perhaps a name to it and some better ideas of what form it might have and what does leadership in it look like, so that we can have a strategic plan to move forward. So I propose that we call it the Holo Movement. Now, this is a fancy sounding term. You may wonder where it comes from. I actually first came across the term Holo Movement in a book by physicist David Bohm, written in 1980, 40 years ago, called Wholeness in the Implicit Order. And Bohm described the universe as an unbroken wholeness of the totality of existence, as an undivided, moving, flowing movement without borders, a movement flowing without borders. And Bohm defined this as the Holo Movement. Now, it was his idea as a physicist to describe this Holo Movement, at the core of which is an implicit order, as a physical explanation of our universe. But he also applied it to cosmology and even the source of consciousness. I today would like to make an application of the term Holo Movement to sociology, and in particular to the social systemic movement for making the great transition and moving our society out of the old paradigm of competition and into the new paradigm of cooperation and wholeness. To get a better idea of what the Holo Movement might look like, I'm sharing this image, and this is the idea of, let's say, 4 organizations sharing together, each organization represented by a circle. And as you can see, this is a representation perhaps of holacracy on the outer part. Each organization retains their autonomy. Here they're not sharing with anyone. Then they're sharing with their neighbor here. And in these parts, 3 different circles are sharing together. And most importantly, as we move to the center, we have a wholeness, a sharing of all organizations together. This is what Bohm would have called the implicit order. Within the center of the movement of movements, where everything converges and we find a common source of cooperation, there is the implicit order of reality, the Holo Movement. The Holo Movement can also be described in simpler ways. You know, Bohm was very fascinated with the idea of holographic imaging. He was one of the first to discuss it in detail, along with his work with Karl Pribram from the University of Stanford, who described our very brain as a hologram and how we can store so much information without a precise point. Where is our memory exist in the brain? It doesn't really have a point. It's a hologram. It's a holographic image of everything we know. Likewise, the universe is a hologram itself, well described in the recent book, The Cosmic Hologram by cosmologist Jude Currivan. So this hologram is the one way that we can have the whole in each individual part, and each individual part as part of the whole. I'm sure we've all heard the famous lines of poetry by William Blake that describe this image: to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. It's not just poetry, it's the way the universe is. It is a Holo Movement of the implicit order. And as I reference Michael Talbot, who wrote the book Holographic Universe, he described it in an analogy of riding a bicycle. You know, we don't really learn to ride a bicycle by theoretically analyzing every muscle movement and every coordination of our body in conjunction with the gears of the bike. As Talbot says, we do not learn to ride a bike by painstakingly memorizing every feature of the process. We learn by grasping the whole flowing movement. So, Holo Movement, going with the flow, understanding the implicit order of the purpose in our souls and how we can contribute to the goodness of the whole. That's the Holo Movement. That's the great transition we're living through right now, the once in future miracle of changing to a new paradigm of cooperation and holistic understanding. Indeed, Audrey Kitagawa, the chair of the Parliament of the World's Religions, in a recent press release for World Unity Week said, civil society is the sleeping giant that has awakened to its power to create global movements for the transformation of humanity. It is us, civil society, individuals, small groups, organizations, nonprofits around the world, the 10 to 15 million organizations that Jim Garrison referred to in the opening throughout our planet, now little by little working together in conjunction with the Holo Movement to make this work. But if it's been described as nameless and leaderless, and we've attempted to give it a name, the Holo Movement, what about leadership? How do we coordinate at that implicit order of the Holo Movement? We're used to traditional hierarchical structures where we have a leader, a boss telling us what to do. And we know that that's not the way forward. We know it's a decentralized system of cooperation, some form of sociocracy or holacracy, as I described in the diagram. But yet, we do have leaders. We're all leaders in and of ourselves. And I encourage you all, within your own personal purpose, to find that leadership within you and move forward. But let's not expect any leader to appear to lead the way for us. There's no Messiah on the horizon. Frankly, with the divisions in society today, I'm afraid if the Messiah appeared and even walked on water, there'd be a big debate about whether that's fake news or some other divisive nature. No, the Messiahs, the leaders, they're all in this together. As Buddhist monk and scholar Thich Nhat Hanh recently said, the next Buddha will very likely be a Sangha. A Sangha meaning a brotherhood, a sisterhood. Let's call it a new term, a humanhood, a gathering together of all brothers and sisters at the implicit core, the order of the Holo Movement, working together as one group, cooperating as leaders. And as the leaders move forward, it'll require new qualities, egolessness, radical collaboration. That's really what we're looking for. This isn't about one organization leading the way. It's about all organizations serving the whole to the best of their service, exploring new forms of collaboration and cooperation, sharing resources, sharing contacts, selflessly giving to the good of the whole. And it will require funding. One of the shortcomings we have, all of us working together, we have enthusiasm, we have motivation, but sometimes we just don't have funds. For that reason, one of the projects I'm working on is called Purpose Earth, to create a fund of funds to provide financial resources for grassroots organizations wanting to make a difference in environmental work and community activization. We are seeing this cooperation of the nameless leaders happening more and more all the time. And I urge you to find the purposeful leader within yourself to become one of them, to join the Implicit Order at the core of the Holo Movement, to move this forward, to explore your selfless, egoless leadership and work together as a team to make the great transition. There's a lot of divisiveness out there these days. It is our duty and our purpose to bring this together. The great Sufi poet Rumi once said, "Out there between notions of right and wrong, there's a field, and I'll meet you there." We might paraphrase that today to say, out there between all the notions of our judgments, of our assumptions, of our notions of reality, there is a field. It's called the Implicit Order at the core of the Holo Movement, seeking cooperation. Out there, somewhere between hierarchy and holacracy, between our dreams and our brightest future, there's a field, and I'll meet you there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Emanuel. Some powerful concepts there that I'm looking forward to exploring afterwards. This whole question that was sitting with me is, okay, so the science and the spirituality are really coming together in this understanding that, yes, it is a holographic world. Like, that's just the nature of it. So that begs the question, well, okay, so it doesn't mean we have to become that holo movement or holographic world, because we are it. But what are the implications of that? Right? What are the implications of that if we accept that as the perspective and as the reality? What does it mean for how we show up in the world? So it's maybe interested in exploring the practical implications for that in the dialogue to come. So thanks for that contribution. Now introducing Jeffrey. Jeffrey, I've only just got to know really through Humanity Rising. But what struck me, Jeffrey, in our conversation was your deep commitment on the one hand to the spiritual development at the individual level, but not just leaving it there. So not just about the individual, but this question of, okay, so what are the implications of that for when we try to work together, when we try to get together in community, collaborate to make an impact? So not just sitting on our own cushion by ourselves, but in the context of trying to engage with each other in the world. So I'm very curious to hear what you have to say about what you've learned around the conditions for radical collaboration and how we could move together collectively more effectively than we are already.
Well, thanks. And actually, listening to Emanuel and Daniel, I think we're going to have some real fun in the chat. There's lots of convergences there. So here we are. Humanity is on the threshold of a new era. And the hierarchical, dog-eat-dog power structures, they're crumbling right before our very eyes. And it's calling for change that's more diverse, more collaborative, with all different forms of human interaction. But the big question is, are we ready? Will we be able to seize the moment? And most importantly, what are the organizing principles that will enable wide-scale and sustainable change to happen locally and globally? Which is why I really thank you, Jim and Peter, for your vision of hosting Humanity Rising and bringing us together so that we can discuss, these great issues. But I think we know it's not enough to recognize the problem. That's easy. It's not enough to want to change or even believe that we need to change. I can remember back when 9/11 happened and the state of shock that the United States was in when everything seemed to just stop. And there was a sense then that the world had changed and that things are going to be different. I mean, there's no way that things could go back to business as usual. Well, I can remember the 2008 financial meltdown. And when it occurred, the Occupy movement rose up with it. but it didn't have an organizing principle to give it structure, to keep the momentum of the movement going. And then there's the Arab Spring, an amazing coming together for radical change, but it snapped back as well. So individually and collectively, and with scathing self-honesty, we have to ask ourselves, how will this time be different? So now here we are at this threshold globally, collectively, facing this opportunity for change. But for substantive change to take place on a global scale, it requires an organizing principle, something that can harness and help us organize and activate our collective wisdom, our insight, our minds, hearts, bodies, collective spirits. So how does the human family move from self-interest to collective interests? I mean, this is really the fundamental problem that we need to solve collectively. Well, it turns out that the answer has been hiding in plain sight all along. Nature has always shown us the way. When we look at the interpretation of Darwin's survival of the fittest, it does work up to a certain point. But nature has shown us time and time again that the real driver for evolution, hands down, is cooperation. That's what really drives evolution in every kingdom, plant, animal, human, not competition. Evolutionary scientist David Sloan Wilson made a statement that people are quoting. He said, "Selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Everything else is commentary." So cooperation among groups will be the catalyst for a burst in evolution. Now, many people are skeptical about evolution because there's an assumption that evolution's a long tail game. It takes too long. We don't have enough time. However, there's ample evidence in the record that confirms that evolution also happens in bursts. And we're in a period right now in Earth and in human history where the conditions are ripe for a quantum leap in evolution, an evolution of consciousness, an evolution of love. Collectively, we've forgotten who we are, the essence of our divine nature. The human family needs a more expansive understanding of our connection to each other, connection to our world, connection to our cosmos. We need a new myth, like Joseph Campbell would say, something that can unlock our DNA, a collective awakening. And people like Teilhard de Chardin, Brother Wayne Teasdale, and many others could see that we're on the threshold of what Wayne Teasdale called a second axial age, or what he termed the inner spiritual age, a preparation for a universal civilization, but a civilization with a heart. And it's not just mere coincidence that at this particular time in human history, the organizing principles that we need for this quantum social and spiritual change are coming to us. And today, I'm really humbled to share with you a possible solution. It comes from the integration of evolutionary science with evolutionary spirituality. The horizontal dimension of social flourishing with the vertical dimension of spiritual transformation. It's being called prosocial spirituality, where evolutionary science meets contemplative inquiry. Prosocial spirituality helps groups function better by applying both scientific and spiritual principles to things like decision-making, conflict resolution, clarity of purpose, interaction with other groups. These scientifically derived methodologies and practices help groups develop a 360 vista that they need to identify blind spots, but also to address challenges and agreed upon solutions that are proactive. So prosocial spirituality merges groundbreaking organizational change methodologies with parallel principles that are applications drawn from the deep well of contemplative spirituality. Prosocial is built upon Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning 8 core design principles, which are grounded in empirical science. It's rock solid. Ostrom's core design principles operate when groups of all kinds, these core design principles are present, then groups tend to flourish. And there's numerous and compelling case studies all over the world that support this fact. These principles can be taught, and the results, most importantly, are repeatable and scalable. Evolutionary scientist David Sloan Wilson recognized the evolutionary significance of Eleanor's work and began collaborating with her some years ago. And then David began working with Paul Atkins, a gifted educator that ended up developing a comprehensive training program that continues to train people and groups all over the world with remarkable success. And you can find more information on this work at prosocial.world. So I became aware of prosocial work through my work with Contemplative Life, which is a digital platform that connects people and communities with transformative practices. And the reason I took note is because there's a dimension of prosocial that's practice-based. And as I learned more about it, I recognized this has amazing possibilities for massive positive change at scale. One of the things that inspired me about prosocial is that it has a global worldview, and that prosocial itself is evolutionary. So it continues to evolve in terms of how it's being taught and how it's being applied. But equally important is the fact that prosocial is grounded in the bedrock of empirical science based on the work of a Nobel laureate. It doesn't get any more empirical than that. But I also sensed it was incomplete. I mean, it provides a highly repeatable process for group flourishing on the horizontal dimension of social transformation, but it doesn't really address the vertical dimension of spiritual transformation. And so I wondered, what if we experimented with integrating Wayne Teasdale's 9 elements of interspirituality with their 8 core design principles? Wayne was a close friend of mine. He was a visionary, contemplative sage, author of The Mystic Heart. So some colleagues and I began experimenting with bringing these two together, these two streams of the 9 interspiritual elements with Ostrom's core design principles. And we discovered that these separate change methods are highly compatible. And together they integrate the horizontal and the vertical dimension of social flourishing with spiritual transformation. So prosocial spirituality is a new initiative that's a collaboration between Prosocial World and Contemplative Life. And it's being sponsored by the Templeton Religious Trust. So we've developed an immersion program for groups and a facilitator training program to prepare people to teach prosocial spirituality to others. We've created an engagement ecosystem that enables groups to collaborate and kind of cross-fertilize their collected wisdom and how they're uniquely applying prosocial spirituality to encourage various learning between different groups. And we're also providing these groups with tools to monitor and measure and evaluate the progress that they have so that we have ongoing data-driven science, which is really important. So in short, we're bringing together science and spirituality, scientists and contemplatives to help forge an integration of knowledge and wisdom, because both are necessary. I mean, they're both exploring this mystery of the cosmos from two different points of view. And we need the best of both for this next quantum leap in consciousness to occur. But we also need one other thing. We need technology, which is why, you know, the Ubiverse and what you guys are doing, I think, is so important. Technology is going to serve as a major catalyst. And our vision is to bring together some of the world's best minds and hearts, designers and engineers, creative geniuses, as well as wise sages, to build a new infrastructure that will enable this transformation to develop quickly and to scale globally. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Lots of food for thought there. And the things that have stuck with me are the need for the organizing principle. So what's going to be sure that we don't drop back like we did after these other kind of peaks around the Arab Spring, 9/11, Occupy, etc. And I hope during the dialogue we'll have time for you to actually go into some of the detail in the context of practical application of, you know, these organizing principles. How do you explain them to us in a way that makes sense and that can enrichen the dialogue that we go into? So I'm looking forward to a bit of meat on the bones, as it were, as we go into the dialogue. So thanks for that. And last but certainly not least, we have George Poor, who I've had the pleasure of knowing for many years. And George, I've known as for his real passion, insight, and commitment to the collective in the context, and particularly of collective intelligence, always asking the question, how do we get to the patterns and the insights that lie in the field between all of us? And how do we take what we pick up there and apply it in a way that will accelerate our collective evolution? So in various iterations through various organizational forms, and George has been doing this work. And so not surprising he asked to go last, because he loves to listen to others, pick out the patterns, amplify them, and enable us to take them forward for the good of the whole. So great to have you with us, George. Lovely to be in touch again, and over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to start with a story. 1984. It was the year when I got my first Macintosh computer. And it was also the year of another event in my life, which was just as enlivening. It was a spotless, beautiful California day, and we were driving to Palo Alto, to the home of my favorite consciousness hero of those years, Barbara Marx Hubbard. I helped organizing the online collaboration community of her campaign for getting the nomination of the Vice President of the United States at the Democratic Convention. So when we met, I have much appreciated how open she was to the use of technology in the campaign. Remember, that was 36 years ago, way before the World Wide Web. But that was not really surprising, because her campaign was based on the idea of creating an office for the future to scan, map, connect, and communicate what is working in the world, which harbingers the future. She didn't get the nomination, but she didn't stop scanning the horizon to identify what works for a better world and what holds us back from getting there. So fast forward to 2003. And I will share a message from her. So here it is. What she said. Oops, I have some problem with the screen sharing, but here it is. So what she said in 2003 is any effort that we can make to connect and create greater synergy and participation in this awakening process is probably the most important thing we can do. That's one of the most important efforts to which I've been dedicating my life work ever since. The other one is working for transformative education. I was bent on changing the world over the years, starting with the 1960s when I was a student revolutionary. And since then, the life, the energy has changed, but the essence is still just how can we make a better world. And then I came across something that shifted my perspective about the how. And that was Lao Tzu, who said that the world is sacred. You can't improve it. And I'm wondering, was Lao Tzu preaching passivity in our relationship to the world? Well, I don't think so. The key to understanding his message is in the last sentence. If you treat it like an object, you will lose it. An alternative to treating the world as an object came in an email this morning from Gail Taylor, a fellow presenter at Humanity Rising. So this is what Gail sent me in the email about scaffolding the communication corridors. And that's referring to both the brain, the axons in the human brain, but I also take it as an essential message regarding social movements, like creating more connections. That's how we increase the intelligence in any collective systems. And the same, this came, the message from Gail came as a response to an email I sent yesterday to some of the presenters I know, asking them about their thoughts on the subject of my talk. So let's explore what scaffolding the communication corridor may mean in the context of social movements. But First, let's take a look at the topology of those movements. So what you see here is just like any topology map. It is just a diagram without any details, and the proportions are not correct, and so it's really a rough sketch, and it will take a lot of further research. I use the simple classification that there are single focus movement, sector specific, and cross-cutting movement. So I'm passionate about cartography, more specifically evolutionary cartography. And as a cartographer, I know that my first and foremost task is to always remember that the map is not the territory. The second is to distinguish some typical elements in the landscape. This is what I tried to do with this sketch of a topology of transformations. So it's a snapshot, really. It's a snapshot of the landscape, but we are also interested in the unfolding of its dynamics. So here is about, you see the same elements, the same content of the landscape, but here you can already see some interconnectedness, some movements towards how the progression from initiatives and networks and movements and ecosystems of movements moving into systems of influence, which is ultimately becoming the new mainstream of conscious social systems. That's just one possible map. I've been playing with this for 14, 15 years, and I would be very interested any other maps of that is showing not only what is out there, but more importantly, what is the dynamics of moving forward. And I also want to talk about a little bit the next stage about the ecosystem of a potential ecosystem. I say a potential ecosystem of transformative adult education. I could have picked a number of other sector-specific potential ecosystems. I picked this one because I am involved with transformative education. The one that you see, the campus co-evolve education for transformation, that is where we are experimenting with prototyping the integration of transformative learning with action research for transformation, ART. And but why I labeled this slide as a potential ecosystem? So what is missing from this picture? Well, it does show a smooth selection of providers of transformative adult education, but the bigger part of the ecosystem is not portrayed here. That is the myriads, millions of people seeking support to develop themselves in ways that also serve their communities and the world. So the ecosystem is not only the providers, but also the seekers of transformative adult education. The other reason why this picture is only a potential ecosystem, because in an actual ecosystem, the niches are connected and supporting each other and the whole. I don't think that we can say the same thing about this picture. But whatever is missing is an opportunity. It's a possibility for evolution.
And we're running out of time. In fact, we're out of time. So if you were able to round off with a couple of conclusions, that'd be great. And then we can come back to some of it in the dialogue.
So this is the last picture that I wanted to share. What is the real power of mobilizing the co-intelligence of humanity rising ecosystem? And I understand that we don't have time to go into the details. You guys will be able to see it. I will upload it. I just want to mention that for radical collaboration, for impact, does require collective self-reflection, a continuous asynchronous communication for fostering local global synergy. Because if we meet only in real time when we are in Zoom, no matter how thousands of people, but if we cannot connect also asynchronously, like in a forum, then we don't have a chance to really build on each other's ideas, to start working together. So that's why I am emphasizing the importance for collective intelligence, the asynchronous communication combined with the real-time one, like in Zoom. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, George, and everybody. Kicking off our men's weekend here with 4 really great contributions. And yeah, just to reinforce the slides people have shared, if you can send them to me, we'll pick up on George's point of the asynchronous collaboration so that the decks can be put into the group, Humanity Rising group in the Ubiverse, which has been the power of this, really, that people have been able to keep reconnecting in between the live events through the Ubiverse, either reviewing the talks or posting and commenting and collaborating with each other, finding out which other organizations are working in similar domains. So it's amazing how Ubiverse is growing into that asynchronous space. The theme that I wanted to pick out, and well, we can start there and let's see where it goes, but it seemed to be a pattern in the conversations, was Daniel was talking about life and nature and us understanding, not necessarily having to create something new, like George pointed to with Lao Tzu, that it can't be improved. But when we remember that we are the earth, right, that we are life, is not us and the earth, but we remember, put back together our relationship, remembering that we actually are the earth from that context, remembering that reality is holographic in terms of the whole is held in the parts. What does that mean for how we organize ourselves for radical collaboration, radical, literally rooted in who we are, rooted in the earth, rooted in us as life? What does it mean for that? For example, in nature, I was thinking as Daniel was talking, what happens in an ecology? Or an ecology is this dynamic system that's looking for dynamic balance, and these niches appear, these needs, and then nature fills the niche, fills the need. So how do we create a system where those niches are responded to rapidly, by humanity in whatever way is needed. And from the holographic perspective, or the general directionality, somebody pointed out, of life being greater interconnectedness at one level, but greater differentiation at the same time, which is completely logical if you think about it, because as the parts differentiate more, they create more relationship and space between them. So as we differentiate, build more relationship. So that process of increasing differentiation and interconnectedness, how do we consciously facilitate that, so that the needs that we have and that we're experiencing, or the niches, as it were, in our human ecology, are responded to as rapidly as possible. So taking that, I'm trying to get us into that perspective, I guess, when we don't have to think up something new. And I have a quote on my wall here: "Nothing is invented, for it's written in nature first. Originality consists of returning to the origin," from Gaudi. So when we make that assumption that we are life, we are the earth, we don't have to think up something new, what does that have to teach us about the way we organize ourselves for collaborating going forward? So open it up. Yeah, Daniel.
I just want to briefly come back to an image that George just showed, this one. And he also, I love what George shared, and he also said that it's about more connectivity. But if you look carefully at that picture, it's scale linked. There are these clusters, and then there are connections. And for me, that is part of how do we learn from the natural patterns and understand that it's not learning from nature as if nature is out there, but really remembering that we're part of this process. Then I think it brings us back to this question that I raised earlier, is like, where do you, like, it's not just about the quantity of connections, it's about the quality of connections and the quality of the information that flows between them that influence emergence in a complex dynamic system. And that also means what information needs to flow globally so we can create a pro-social world, and what work do we need to do regionally in order to enable that. And that's where the one thing that I felt that was a little bit missing on the map that George showed with the ecosystems of transformative education is, how does that ground? There was all the great institutions that work with the evolution of consciousness and the kind of transformative leap and all that integral, wonderful stuff. But the same ecosystem is connected and aligned with ecosystems restoration camp, Gaia University, Gaia Education, all the permaculture networks, all the agroforestry networks, that's the grounding of that sort of disembodied spiritual evolutionary impulse into the, how do we actually live that practice? And because the two are not separate.
Daniel and Peter, I would like to respectfully disagree with only one thing. Yes, we are life, and we are more than life, because if we live our social identity through the biological metaphors, we risk to enter into a reductionism. Because, just to give you one example, that Peter was talking about the niches, how the integration is connecting. And Daniel, you pointed to the clusters. So in nature, the clusters, or the clusters in the brain, or the niches in the ecosystem, they don't have to learn and study what is the distinctive gifts of each to the ecosystem in order to functionally align with each other. In human ecosystems, in movements, this alignment will not just naturally, organically happen. People who are engaged in this movement, they need to understand what is the distinctive contribution of each entity to the larger ecosystem, so that they can align with each other along those pathways. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Sounds like the core design principles. And, one of the things that I really resonated with what Emanuel is saying is it starts with some kind of shared purpose, some kind of common aim. And then because if you don't have a common aim, it's hard to kind of line up. It's not enough, but it's kind of like the first step on the ladder. But there's also, for this to really happen, it has to happen both internally and externally, meaning the inner life is just as vast as the outer world. But in the inner life, we're the only ones that can go on that journey. So it's very personal. And it's the, the combination of the inner and the outer and how they come together, and the combination from the particular to the general, a group to multi-groups, that provides the opportunity for this rich, natural, incubation of possibility.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Jeff's comments there. This essence of purpose, I think this is the inner life, and we've all been born for a real reason, and particularly in this time in history. And I've noticed here in some of the comments in the chat that what are the solutions? What can we practically do? And I would say, first, find your inner purpose. Figure out what your talents are, what moves you, what motivates you, and what your skills are. Analyze that, and then put it into action. And I would say for most of us, put it into action on a very local level. Now, we're speaking in broad concepts about systems and the evolution of biology and quantum leaps in evolution, which is all well and good, and I fully support all that, but I encourage everyone to start on a very local level. The niche is what's wrong in your hometown, in your home community. Do you need a new sewage system? Do you need to plant trees? Do you need to change your city council? Get some foreseeable goal that you can achieve. Build a small support community around you and get something done, and then build on that and outwards from your inner purposeful vision towards making things happen and growing into the whole.
I want to pick up on Robin Wood's mentioning our evolution and collaboration is mimetic and informatic, not biological. I would agree with that sentence if it said and biological. Because it's also a reply to what George said. I agree with you, George. And all that cultural cognitive system emerges out of biology and depends on that biology. And part of the concern I have a little bit of our current obsession with creating the platform of platforms and the connection through technology as we're doing right now, which is wonderful. I'm not against it. And we need to be really clear that that technology conditions how we think and what will continue to emerge. It's not a neutral tool. And it's the reconnection to understanding both that our biological nature needs to fit into the life-sustaining patterns of a planetary biosphere in order for us to continue to evolve all that wonderful perspective making of life having deeper and deeper notions of itself, which is what I think part of our magical contribution to all of this is. It's literally the universe waking up to its own participatory mystique and magic.
I appreciate what you say, and my perspective differs from it, and I feel that this kind of differences is exactly the richness, because if we could ask everybody who is listening to this conversation to contribute how they see the world, we would probably get a variety of worldviews, and they are all right. It's not a question of wrong or right, but they all contribute. So the question is that how we are moving forward together. And for that, I agree that we need to find a kind of umbrella vision of what we all feel attracted to. That's what I try to catch with the Thrivable future expression.
So George, I didn't quite understand from what you said what you see as being the difference between what Daniel said. So what's the potential creative tension there between what he said and what you believe?
Well, I think it's in the starting point. So it's a question of temperament or starting point where I am taking my starting, my background is I'm a sociologist and movement organizer. So my starting point is social sciences, the largest whole that I am putting my arms around is humanity. Now, from Daniel's perspective, as I understand, the largest whole that he puts his arms around is the whole living system. And of course, I know that I am part of it, so I cannot be against it. It just, I don't have as intimate relationship with the whole of the living as I have with the human system, which is my focus. And I know that disrespecting the biosphere has a huge price, and ultimately it can lead to our extinction. So there is not a huge difference. It's just the starting points and focus, emphasis maybe.
I understand that. It's just for me, an invitation every morning is to remember that what I identify with here as my body has more non-human cells than it has human cells. I have an entire ecosystem in me and on me that gives me life and balances health and connects me to that larger system that also provides the air I breathe. So it's I completely respect that we need to find our focal points, and I love your work. And you whether you look at it or not, you sit in that biological dynamic as well as and I do, like in this kind of panel, we can definitely talk about the fact that there is the danger of reducing things to Gaia, like to some sort of living planet whole. I'm not talking about that. Like in the wider, what Emanuel was speaking to, clearly consciousness is primary and is informing matter. But on this planetary scale that we're participating in, we need to make sure that the biosphere is evolving with us. And that's where I feel is the being much more nuanced about what technologies we use and how we use them, that we really need an urgent conversation on if we try to steer our way through the next tricky decades.
Daniel, can I just ask you to go a little deeper into that? And what are the actually opinions you hold around the technologies we use, and what if there's anything you see we should be doing differently with our technologies based on the perspective you just described? Or what are the questions we should be, let's try to go beyond the questions. Yeah. I bet you have an opinion. Love to hear it.
Thank you. Well, it all comes from really diving deep into this wonderful advice by Buckminster Fuller that if you want to change the way people think, don't tell them what to think. Give them a tool, the use of which will change the way they think. And at some point, I thought, okay, how is my use of money, my use of this computer, my use of technology constantly conditioning the way I think? And what I've noticed in my own life is that it's drawn me more and more to these wonderful visionary conversations with brilliant minds that have nourished me and been meaningful to me and that I wouldn't want to miss. And it has the danger of even more disembodying me personally. I actually need, where you were coming in on like this, I've just been playing out on the water with my family and I'm back in this space here. Both are wonderful, but I think that a lot of the healing that we now need to do, the integration of millennia of indigenous wisdom with the wisdom that we've evolved since the Enlightenment into a new form of participation really needs to understand this embodiment of that we are life in a deeper way. And it is the mimetic blocks that we have of not going there enough. And so technology is super powerful in enabling us to stay connected and have information and change and access collective intelligence. But it's the predisposition that we think most solutions are technological rather than social and narrative based. And it's that conversation around when to use it, to what extent, how often, and how ubiquitous it needs to be in our lives. And yeah, I don't want to take too much time to now go into specific examples.
Yeah, no, beautiful. I mean, the way it's actually a theme that has been in the talks we've had so far, and the way I would frame it is this creative tension on the one hand between evolution and transcendence, this kind of linear perspective or story we're telling ourselves about moving away from something towards something else, right? That's and most dangerously in the spiritual development movement, personal development, where there's this whole thing about transcending the body, transcending the material, getting beyond it. It's all an illusion kind of story. And if we don't combine that transcendence with immanence, right, with actually presence, so this image of the tree sending its branches up, but also sending its roots down at the same time, then we will end up going off planet, we'll disembody quite literally. And the point is we manifest it to be here. So that creative tension, I think, is one that's really present at the moment, this kind of even linear time, which is actually a recent construct on the planet, we just accept as normal, right? So there's this tension between linearity, which is kind of more and away from evolution, literally, spinning out of something.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's that same pattern? And then I'd love to bring in the others and see how you kind of see that.
Yeah, yes, I think it is. And it's very closely linked also to our previous position right now that we want solutions so quickly, and that we jump to these quick fixes rather than this understanding that it is all linked to that Lao Tzu quote that George quoted. It's the bizarre paradox that it is just fine, tatsvatam, this is it. And at the same time, we need to have this angst of trying to evolve it and participating wisely in it. And it's an embracing of the paradox of the world's perfect as it is, and we're continuously called into the audacity of trying to improve it.
Beautiful. Thank you. Jeff, you unmuted yourself. You'd like to jump
in? Technology is a wonderful servant and a terrible master. It's a means to an end. And part of the challenge that we have right now with technology and with how the first stage of the internet developed is it got co-opted by intermediaries. And what they did is they, gave us what looked to be free, but it wasn't free. And so what's happened is it's controlling what we see, how we see it, our experience of it. And so part of the challenge is that those that have the design and engineering creative geniuses tend to be younger, because that's where the action's at. But they also don't have the depth of experience of people that, have been in the game a little bit longer. Those that have been in the game longer tend to not keep pace with technology. And so there's this gap, and this gap is widening. So part of what's really necessary in terms of kind of re-envisioning and re-engineering what comes next is that we need to bring those that have the depth of experience and sagely wisdom that don't know about engineering and design into the conversation, have a seat at the table. And those that have these creative geniuses that don't necessarily know what to build, but they know how to build it, so that we can create something different that then serves what we're all pointing at here. Because what we need now is solutions. We need tangible, practical solutions to do this. And we just can't rely on the old systems and the old infrastructure to do it. We need to create something new. And that's what we're doing, bringing together these ideas. The next phase of it is the kernels that come out of this that are actionable, that are meaningful. We need to continue this conversation so that we can do something that is even more actionable.
I love the actionableness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that's a good lead into the kind of as we move towards the end here. And George started on it with his last slide. So, you know, if you were consultants, advisors to Humanity Rising, that has managed to gather, you know, we've got 10,000 people, 800 organizations all committed to trying to make a positive difference in the world. We have this rhythm of people wanting to share their wisdom, people wanting to listen and engage. How would we go about turning, as Jim says, conversations that matter into actions that make a difference?
Well, a good start would be engaging all the interested presenters in a curated, generative, action-oriented conversations about what matters, since you must have had a reason why you guys invited these people, and why couldn't we build on the collective intelligence of this group, not an exclusive group, but at least to start rolling the ball until something comes together that is coherent enough to share with the larger universe and build on it. So that's one thing. And of course, you can also turn the Ubiverse platform into enabling the more than 10,000 people there for forming co-creative communities of practice, transformating communities. And as everybody knows, that it's more than technology. Technology will not do it. It's human facilitation that will be also needed for that.
I think that sounds wonderful. And it's yet another drawing us into in that same poem that I quoted from Wendell Berry, where he said that there are no unsacred places, there are only sacred places or desecrated places. Before that line, he says, stay away from anything that obscures the place it is in. And to some extent, this conversation and these networks of wise people trying to talk about how do we network and what kind of platform do we create and blah, it's all in that disembodied space. And what I'm saying is, to find the balance, to really work the polarity, we need to pay equal assistance. Somebody, Liliana or somebody in the comments said, Daniel is implying that instead of spending time in front of the computer, it's equally important to spend time in community, connecting and sharing space and energy with real people, with real trees, with real soil. And if we can do both, also create processes where people in place have the conversation of how do we change our presence in this place and become a healing presence to this place, both socially, economically, local economies, and ecologically. And that needs a redesign in terms of political systems. We need to create political systems based on subsidiarity. We need a redesign of the economic system that empowers local economies and diverse types of economies, diverse types of currencies, so we disconnect from the driver of that global push. And we also need to, in order to enable that, redesign food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, water sovereignty, in order to create the resilience to have these conversations at the local level, and simultaneously the kind of conversations globally that George was talking about.
It reminds me, I think Emanuel wants to come in. It reminds me of Margaret Wheatley's work, where she talks about the evolution of collectives from networks, just being connected up in a way like we are now, to communities of practice, which means you've got to have a practice somewhere to be able to share about with each other and learn from. So if we've got action on location in place, and then we're sharing about that and learning from each other, to the third phase that she calls a system of influence. How that collective, then rather than coming in, sharing and going back, somehow crystallizes into a force that actually acts with an impact greater than any of the sum of the parts. So that's maybe a piece to hold as well. So Emmanuel, you'd unmuted yourself. Would you like to come in here?
Well, thank you for that comment, Peter. That was very, very helpful. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, first of all, nature gives us the messaging that we need to know. As Lynn Margulis once said, the single-celled organisms didn't take over the world by competition or warfare. They did so by networking. So one, we know that nature in and of its essence is a cooperative. And works and builds evolution through cooperation. We as human beings, separated a bit from the whole by our consciousness, have lost our connection with that wholeness. We tend to think too much and think that in our analysis that we're in a competitive social Darwinian atmosphere here, and that only through competition will we succeed. So we need to get back to the natural order of things and change our mindset. And often that involves a very self-imposed de-brainwashing, getting rid of the socialization and cultural conditioning that we've heard since we were small children about the nature of society, the competitive nature of the world, a notion of scarcity, all of these concepts that our own survival instincts have embedded in us and are in fact not true and not in tune with nature. So we need to reprogram ourselves, use our own technology to believe in our inner potential and our own transformational capacity for an evolutionary leap is already within us. It's just latent there. So I encourage everyone to explore the next level outside of their comfort zone, something that's tangible, that's reachable, but is also going to push them to take in their inner capacities and explore them further. So I think everyone just needs to do a little self-analysis about what they've been deluded by their culture, what their true capabilities are, and be brave and bold enough to envision those and go for them, but primarily on a smaller scale to begin with, and form a community, a support ecosystem around you to support it so you can learn to work in a group and get something done that will reinforce your vigor and enthusiasm for taking it to the next level.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Lots of good resonance in the chat. Well, we're going to wrap up in a sec. Shall we just see if there any last closing comments for anyone around this question, this core question of how do we create the radical collaboration that's going to enable us to make the scale of impact and speed of change that we all know is needed right now. So let's go in the reverse order, shall we, from the speakers. So George, you want to kick us off with a closing comment?
Well, if you want radical collaborations, I do. Then what I'm longing for is more intergenerational learning and transcontextual mutual learning across the different contexts, different social sectors in which we are seeking answers to the challenges of a society, a social system that is dying and the new is yet to come. Intergenerational learning and transcontextual mutual learning across the context.
Great, thank you. Jeff?
I would say begin with inner work that should follow outer action. Move from personal well-being to group well-being to those that are outside your group and everyone else. And it would be helpful if activists became more contemplative and developed a deep practice, and that contemplatives become more active and take the fruits of what they've developed into the world.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Emanuel.
I would encourage everyone to project themselves into the future, 30, 50, maybe 100 years from now, whether you'll be alive or not. But let's assume you'll be alive, and you'll be looking back at these times, talking to your grandchildren. And there it will be a different world, one where we have transformed, we're living in peace and harmony with new systems. And your grandchild is saying to you, where were you when the great transition happened? What were you doing? And you can tell them, I was on the front lines. I was there, locked arms, marching forward, taking action, getting it done. I was there. I was part of this, and I gave it my all. And I would just say radical collaboration is radical collaboration within yourself to give it everything you've got, whatever that may be, funding, resources, talents, energy, give it all. This is the big game. We're on for it together. So don't come up short.
Beautiful. Thank you, Emanuel. Okay, Daniel, wrap it up for us.
I'm reminded of before when our detour started, William Blake said, "May God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." And what he was speaking to was disappearing into the mind. One way of knowing. We have 4 ways of knowing. Thinking is only one of them. And I think one first thing to really collaborate beyond just the human family and draw wisdom from our larger identity with life means we have to quieten the mind often enough. So I would agree with Jeff that that's a meditation in nature is a wonderful way to do that. And also picking up on what Jeff just said, if we all every day get up and redefine activism as what am I activating with the power of my intention? Where am I going to put the gift of my breath, my spirit today? And understand that our thoughts, words, and actions have agency in this larger whole, and that we sometimes don't actually need to make the perfect strategy and the scale out and taking it to scale and all these wonderful things that come from the thinking mind. And that actually by truly changing our being state, and the way we walk through the day and relate to our community, into our place, we are repatterning the future in the presence. The misconceived idea of time that you spoke to briefly, Peter. We have the power of changing the future right now in the way we relate and how we activate the world around us. And it's a constant choice of embracing dilemma navigation, embracing paradoxes.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions. Yeah, I'm not even going to try to summarize anything. People will be able to look back at it all on the in the Ubiverse. You'll be able to find the presentations and things there. I've asked people who've been sharing links to articles and things, if you can put those in posts in the Ubiverse, it means they'll stay there for the asynchronous spaces, George said, and not get lost in this space, and be available to people who weren't able to join us today. So please do share those resources through the platform. And now I'm going to hand back to Jim to wrap it up for today.
Well, thank you, Peter, for putting together such an extraordinary panel, in the depth and the layers of this conversation. As Peter says, it's hard to summarize. Let me tease out 2 points that were made that I think for me are salient as we think about how we radically collaborate moving forward. One, Daniel, I was just very impressed with your initial presentation and your notion that, we are an ecology of radical collaboration. We think of ourselves as humans, distinct from the environment, but as you point out, we're mostly we're mostly microbes and bugs and viruses and all kinds of things that we would probably kill if we saw outside ourselves, but in our gut and in our skin, in our hair, in our heart, everything that we are is a radical collaboration of nature. And I was thinking too, you know, we breathe every couple of seconds. And we're breathing in oxygen because the trees on the planet are breathing it out. And we're breathing out carbon dioxide, and that's what they breathe in. So if you look at nature, nature is an exercise in radical collaboration. And if we could just remember that, I think that it would make our task in just getting along with each other so much more easier. You know, Sartre's great line, hell is other people. Why is it that other people are so hard to get along with? Why are we always bumping into each other? We're in a whole ecosystem of radical collaboration, and all we want to do is compete. I mean, it's a peculiar irony of the predicament of the human species. And so I just want all of us to just take it in as you sit here listening to my voice, that you're mostly non-human. We're just embedded in an ecosystem of life. And the second point, I think for me, I mean, George, you touched on it, but Emanuel, you reiterated it right in your last comment, and that is that, you know, 10 to 15 years from now, we're going to look back like we do to the 60s. Those of us who came out of the 60s, and we ask ourselves, what did we do at that moment? In my case, the Vietnam War. What were you doing? What was your response more recently to George Floyd? And I think you're giving very sage advice, Emanuel, that all we can do in this moment is give everything that we have. You know, what is it that wakes you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and grips your heart, demands your attention, and gives you no choice but to dedicate your life? And it doesn't matter really what it is, as long as you're putting your life as the proximate causation for that which you seek to happen. You know, back to Gandhi, be the change. And it's within this context, Jeff, I think what you said is the bottom line. In order to be fully present at this critical moment, we have to have a radical collaboration inside ourselves between our inner and outer dimensions. We can't get along with others unless we can get along with ourselves. So your notion that the contemplatives need to be activists and the activists need to be contemplatives is, I think, the song of harmony that all of us need to sing. And I think if we can embody this notion of radical collaboration, which is really biomimicry, we can mimic the world in which we find ourselves. If in this moment of critical need, we give ourselves completely to the moment. Remember Martin Luther King, you don't begin to live until you're ready to die for something. What are we willing to die for? What are we willing to live for? And within that context, how do we unite our heart and our mind, our hands, our bodies, our souls as one integrated, pulsing act of compassion into the world. If we could do that, we would radically collaborate so effectively, the pivot of the world would turn. One of the ideas that came up just yesterday, which is an exercise in radical collaboration, came from Yolanda Eisenstein, and that is to set up Humanity Rising subgroups around the world in local languages, sort of like TEDx. That's a new thought that's coming into our system. You know, we've been bursting at the seams. We're upwards of 450 speakers, nearly 400 organizations in only literally a few months. And as this thing burgeons out and people come to Humanity Rising day after day after day, because we're going to keep this going for as long as the pandemic unfolds and probably beyond. We're dedicated to radical collaboration. And if there's anything any of you want to do to further this discourse and to bring people together in your local town or your local country, your organization, around how we experience and how we work together to build a world beyond the pandemic that is worthy of us and that we are worthy of it, please let us know. And go on to Ubiverse, tell us what you're doing, and we'll support you in every way that we possibly can. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow. 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time for the next discussion on personal resilience. How do we, in the midst of this maelstrom, stay resilient in our own selves? That's the question we take tomorrow, having spent the last hour and a half on radical collaboration. So thank you, Daniel, Emanuel, Jeff, George, Peter. Splendid, man. Really well done. Thank you, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.